think the processes mentally that I've been going through do have parallels with other spiritual sort of practices that people go through. And I think there is a lot of value in trying to sort of meditate on these things and look at some of these meditative practices as a way of kind of handling what's going on in the world. And I think it can help you to function more rationally and more effectively and more dispassionately. And the other big thing which came out of the Thich Nhat Hanh videos that I'd watched, I haven't watched many, I've only probably watched like 2, 3, 4 hours altogether, spread over several months, was the idea of compassion, because he was very big on compassion and how you should be compassionate, because when somebody is acting out of fear or out of aggression or whatever, there's probably some underlying issue within them that they haven't properly identified. They haven't sat and meditated on the issue. They haven't sat and thought what's actually causing them to act that way. They've just kind of gone with whatever feeling, fear or anger, and just acted it out or used it against other people. And so that's quite useful as well, to consider that sort of situation. Why does one act the way that one does, particularly when it gets to negative actions, And then I listened to, in fact, I was just finishing off listening to it before I came to see you guys. You may have seen this already. There was a talk by Matthias Desmet, who's a Belgian professor. He talked about the COVID situation being an example of mass formation psychosis. Did you hear about this?
Vaguely, but I'm not seeing it. But
it's quite interesting. He basically goes through that the population, it was a mass hypnosis of the population to trigger them into conforming or behaving in certain ways. And they go through all the details, like the masks and so forth, and people acting a certain way to, in their mind, protect their community from the COVID.
The most important thing, I believe, is always that the people who do not buy into the narrative, who have the capacity, the capability to take a critical distance of the narrative, continue to speak out. Continue to speak out in public space. That's the most important advice I could give in this situation.
Because you see, within COVID, there's a lot of conformity action within mask wearing, the 2 meter rule and all that.
Exactly.
I look at it, a lot of it is almost like a test, isn't it? And I see now,
I think so,
with the fuel crisis and all the, I think there's a little test there, because it's quite open now that people can see that the major corporates of these energy companies are all making huge profits. That's not hidden.
Exactly.
And so you've got to reconcile those things. And because people have so been beaten down and so mind controlled, they're not acting on it. They're not connecting it to a point where they're...
It's like they're numb, isn't it?
They've
been numbed.
That's the point.
And it's almost like they're saying, right, we can get away with telling them, all these companies are profits. They'll probably get mad about it, but they're not going to do anything.
They're not going to do anything.
They're not going to do anything. They're not going to come. That's not going to be enough for them to come together enough to
right on the streets and stuff.
And this is sometimes you can get a bit exasperated with that, but then I think, right, if you're putting that exasperation in, are you just adding then this negative energy to it? So I try and pull back from that, because I feel that
good. Yeah, go on. I'm glad you said that. Go on. Yeah.
Because I feel that with the controllers is they need us to manifest all this crap. They have to do it through us. So they have to.
That's exactly kind of what I was saying.
And this is what resonated with me when you were talking like that, and because this is something that I've been thinking of quite a while. So it's just resisting that and gaining your mind back from their control. And I think a lot of people, this is the hypnosis I think that people are under, is it's all this mind control, this perception. It's a lot of people think it's their own, but it's not. And it's just for me, it's just gaining back your mind back. And being able to get back in control of your own mind, because otherwise you're going to give it to them. And once you give it to them,
you give you power.
It's getting power back. So
you give you power. That's exactly what I was saying, really. And this idea of manifesting what they want rather than something else which you've come up with from your own research and your
because
own.
I think they're not bothered if we get mad about it.
No, they're not. That's what they want.
Yes. So because that just fuels because that keeps on a low vibration.
Yeah, and what I was glad they discussed in this Matthias Desmet video, which was at the end, is how the people who are trying to expose the COVID narrative as being fraudulent, which it is, of course.
Yeah.
They also can get caught up in their own thing, whereby, for example, they'll call people that follow the COVID narrative sheep.
Yes.
And I've really tried to avoid doing that myself.
Yeah.
And I've tried not to do that. I probably have, implied that from certain things that I've posted on. I know I've posted a few memes on my COVID pandemic investigation website, and in fact, it goes on to check the evidence as well. And I'm sure I've posted some of these memes which are kind of making fun of some of the people or the aspects of following the narrative. I know I have.
Yeah.
But I've tried to resist that because,
I think we've all been guilty of that, haven't we?
We have to
kind of hold our hands up. That helps.
Absolutely. Because of course we've been exposed to a lot of stuff over the years, which has kind of protected us from the COVID narrative, really. Or that's a word that I like. Well, I don't like to use it, but it seems sort of appropriate. So, but the point is, and what they said in that Matthias Desmet, and this ties in with the Thich Nhat Hanh teachings, essentially, is compassion. You've got to say, look, they were doing the best that they could based on the information that they thought was true.
The most important thing is just to speak out without being too convinced that you are the only one who knows the truth. It's just best to speak out, to give your own opinion, to stick to the ethical duty of articulating the words that you think are sincere and honest, without too much being too fanatically convinced yourself of what you believe in, and without really trying to convince the other people. So it's just the optimal strategy to deal with this phenomenon, I think, is just sticking to the ethical duty of articulating the words that seems at that moment sincere and honest to you.
And it's a bit like, again, going back to the environmental movement, saying all humans are bad, we need to do this, that, and the other. It's evil to do all these things.
I agree,
But the point is that it's not that. It's people are essentially ignorant. They're not enlightened. They don't know that they've been manipulated into this, false narrative that fossil fuels have to be used. We need internal combustion engines to run our economy and so forth. So there's got to be this increase in compassion all around, both for people that have come from the mainstream perspective. They're just doing a job. We don't like it. We don't like what they've done. And I've said myself, these people should go to prison, and I think they should. Really, the MPs and the police chiefs. I've said this before. Said it on an interview recently. And that's my way of expressing my kind of unhappiness with the way these people have behaved, and the fact that they haven't at some point stopped and gone and examined the evidence and gone into this contemplative or meditative state about it and thought, hang on a minute, am I being taken for a ride with this? And instead they decided to try and maintain this hard exterior, maintain their job, maintain the status quo. They haven't gone along with the truth, basically. And that's one of the things which I think is very, very difficult to reconcile is this idea of knowing the truth, communicating the truth to people, but also at the same time being compassionate. Because I get quite upset when people tell lies after I've told them what the truth is, and I've written about this in my books. And you can end up quite exasperated by this. So one of the challenges then is to remain compassionate to these people and try and see if they do have a reason, why they've chosen to support deception rather than expose it and challenge it. And I still have a hard time with that. Maybe I shouldn't name names, but I think but I'm going to. I mean, if you want to edit this bit out, you're welcome to do so. But one of the big disappointments to me was Neil Sanders.
Yeah, we'll probably share that, and that's going to go on camera now.
So as I say, if you want to edit this bit out, it's fine. Something stuff.
I mean, but respect to him and everything.
Exactly, and I will give him his respect. Because he came and did talks in 2012 in Derby for me, away talk. It was excellent, and I think he provided an accessible set of information about the mind control and about propaganda and Edward Bernays. I think he was the person that I learned about Edward Bernays from, and all that, the propaganda techniques which were developed in the 40s or the 50s. And then, of course, he gets into all the mind control stuff in the CIA and all of that, Very, very useful stuff, very accessible. I read both his books, and the books are called Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, which you more or less said, I think, 10, 15 minutes ago, you were saying that, and I thought that was a really good title.
I've read them both resonated. Yeah.
Exactly, me too. And he was kind enough to give me the books. But Neil Sanders has been on Facebook and on his blog supporting pretty much the standard COVID narrative, that it's a real virus which is a threat to people, etc. I don't know about the finer details. And he also seems to support the standard narrative about climate change to a large extent. And I've asked him if he'll read my book, about climate change, where I lay out all the evidence that, this is just a scam. Yeah. It's another fear-based control narrative like COVID, just with a different spin on it, It's been much longer term, some of its scope is bigger than COVID, some of it is perhaps narrower to some degree, but it's all part and parcel of the same thing. Neil Sanders has never acknowledged that. He just continues to support the narrative. So in those sorts of cases, you think, what the hell's happened here then? Because this guy should be awake to all of this, yet he appears to be following the standard, narrative of things. And there's probably more than one example of that, and some of those that you and I have spoken about. So at the same time as going through some of these thought processes, I'm still kind of aghast at folks like him and some of the arguments that I see, over these things. And I will push the boat out a little bit, but then I'll just walk away. I don't want to get into conflict with Neil Sanders or anyone else for that matter. But by the same token, I can't, when he's making such statements, I will challenge him the same way that I'll challenge him for anyone from the mainstream media and ask him to justify his stance based on evidence, and also ask him why he's not willing to examine the evidence that I've put before him. When, fair's fair kind of thing, tit for tat, I've examined the evidence that he's put before me for the topics that he's written about and been interested in, on a friendly one-to-one basis. That's the way I look at it as well. So, there's been a bit of that that I think tends to weigh you down on these occasions. So we can sort of take a sort of sideways step with this. Because there's a couple of threads which come to mind following on from what we've just been talking about. And the first is, the various narratives are put forward by various groups within society, if you will. And I was fairly recently given to write, which I called Should We Trust the Science? And I think that was the subtitle, but Worlds Apart, Should We Trust the Science? And so, if we have a lack of compassion for the mainstream media and the people that are acting in it or from it, and we have a lack of compassion for the people in academia, could that result in us throwing out the idea of science being useful in our lives? And this has been another quite serious issue in my view of things. For example, I know we've talked about the flat Earth stuff before, and this came to mind because I had a chap that contacted me quite recently. Now, he first contacted me way back in 2004. He was interested in Stephen Greer's disclosure project, as was I. When I got listed on that website, he found my email address. He contacted me. We were talking about UFO stuff, and over the years, so that's like 17, 18 years ago since I first spoke to this guy. He'd been to my house once, chatted to him on the phone quite a lot. And he sent me some good links. He was the guy that sent me Pet Goat 2, that Pet Goat 2 video, which is very, very weird. And it's a video which apparently shows...
You mentioned this before.
Yeah, I might have brought it up. It's about 10, 15 minutes, and it's like a CGI video of some psychedelic boat trip, and it's got a Jesus figure in it, and then it's apparently got something going on in the background which looks like the Twin Towers turning to dust, and some reference to George Bush and 9/11 and stuff. and it's one of these that appears to have predictive programming elements within it. And I watched this and thought, wow, that's pretty, that is just pretty mind-blowing, that. Pet Go 2, it's called, I think it's still on YouTube. It's all very subliminal, very kind of abstract, And he sent me that, and I thought, well, yeah, so he's really thinking about stuff, because I hadn't thought about that, It's good observations he's made on this one, And he sent me various things like that over the years, And then more recently, he's starting to move towards the flat Earth stuff. And he's starting to move towards this Tartaria stuff, right? The Tartarian Empire, which is something that's been put in front of me a little bit. And just very briefly, that Tartarian Empire, I think there's a lot of disinformation in there, somehow connected to the flat Earth. I'm not quite sure how, but I think the Tartarian Empire stuff that's come out is kind of like a cover, a distraction from looking at the real ancient civilization stuff, like Lemuria, Atlantis, the work of people like Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, and others, studying the civilization which went before. And again, that factors, I think, into, we've talked about WEF, we talked about, the Bilderbergs, all of that. Another factor is, are there people that have survived, or are bloodlines that have survived this very ancient civilization, 100,000 years older, that have survived into modern humanity, that are, again, dictating a lot of what's going on. And again, I think there is something to that. Too hard to get into now, but I think there's something to that.
I think they certainly, whoever's running the world, they know a lot more than we do about the way human psychology and the way things are.
The history of the solar system.
Everything,
I think they know a lot more about that. The true history of the Earth.
Yes, there's definitely some deep understanding that they use to their advantage.
Exactly. Yeah. And so anyway, this guy wrote to me, and he says, "Oh, have you looked into this jet fuel hoax?" And I thought, well, kind of, yeah. This idea that jets don't actually use fuel, they're actually using some free energy device, and there's no fuel on them, for real. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there are videos. If you put jet fuel hoax onto YouTube, you have these quite apparently sophisticated videos showing, that these jets don't have any fuel, they can't have any fuel, blah blah blah, and they'll convince you that this is the case. And he asked me if I'd ever heard of this, and I said, well, yeah, but it's just nonsense, And then he started having a go at me, saying, well, why is it nonsense, And I pointed out to them that, look, you just couldn't get away with such a hoax. There'd be too many people involved on the ground on a daily basis. I know we said similar things about Apollo, but that's different because that was only that involved a couple of specific sites in the world.
And that's it,
It was a certain group of people, like NASA, and it only went on for a set time period between mid-60s and early 70s, 72 it finished. So there are all kinds of differences that you can't just say, well, if you believe that the Apollo was fake, why don't you believe the jet fuel hoax? That was this kind of logic, and other people have tried to challenge with similar logic. And it's quite complicated to get around and convey to them what we've just covered in summary there. And, when you've got these jets being refueled by ground crews, thousands of hours are spent doing this at multiple sites across the world.
Are they saying that commercial jets?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I don't think it even specified whether it was commercial or real, but, and I tried to point out some of these things. And he says, well, you need to watch this video. So I said, well, look, send me the video then, and I'll point out where it's wrong, and because I hadn't studied the actual video. Fair's fair. He said, look, if you studied the video, only a bit of it, he said, well, but he never even bothered to send me the video. He never even bothered to send me the video, which I was a bit disappointed about. But that led me on to think, well, and I get this a few times, particularly with the flat Earth people. Well, they'll say, oh, you don't believe Apollo, Andrew. You don't believe 9/11. So why don't you believe that they can lie about the shape of the Earth? And my answer is, well, I wasn't there on 9/11. I wasn't there at any of the Apollo launches. I don't know any of the astronauts, but I can observe for myself that the Earth is not flat, and here's how you do it.
And this is the thing, it's quite simple, isn't it, really?
You need a bike, a couple of sticks, and some basic algebra, with the ability to use a ruler, and some time and energy and patience. That's all you need. So you don't need NASA, you don't need YouTube, you don't need, well, you might need some websites to teach you how to do algebra. So is algebra a hoax? Is algebra fake? And this is what I tried to convey to this guy, that he's approaching me, to ask for my opinion. I'm showing him or explaining to him in brief, not in absolute, meticulous detail, why something must be a hoax, and that this is a psychological operation, and he won't accept it for some reason. He don't just say, "Oh, I can see what you mean, Andrew." He still wants to challenge me on it. And a lot of people now, said, "Well, we've seen that what's damage science can do with COVID, with the vaccine injuries that have come about and so forth, and many other examples. Not just that, we could cite, examples for the rest of the decade where science has produced bad things." But my point in trying to explain to him and to others is that I'm in a bit of a different position to him. I've been through university. I learned how to program a computer. Yeah. I learned how to solve problems. I learned how to do algebra. And in this article I wrote called Worlds Apart, I cite a bit of my professional experience, which is whereby we were developing this robot controller for a garment assembly project where robots could actually stitch garments together. Okay. And to do that, you had some quite sophisticated motor controls, because the robots had motors in them and they need to be controlled in a particular way. And it uses a method of proportional placentical control. Now, the way that works is you need to understand algebra, you need to understand calculus, and you need to be able to make measurements. And those are all skills that you either do at school or university. And some people, can manage it, and some people can't. Fair enough. It's not meant to be a judgment either way on those people. But I was one of the people that could. Yeah. And I was able, when I was given this job to do, I had to write some software for this robot controller so that, it would do a certain thing in a certain time. And when I was given this job, I was given an equation which was used, which defined how this robot controller worked, and I had to implement that equation in software. So I did that, generated some data, and then when I ran it, the behavior was not correct. It didn't do what they wanted it to do. So I looked at this, and I made some measurements, I put some numbers down, and then I had to go back to the guy that gave me the equation, say, "Look, sorry, this don't work. I don't know why it doesn't work, but it don't work." And I showed him why, and I showed him the data, went through it with him, and he said, "Oh, okay, leave it with me." And then I think the next day or the day after he came back, and he had a modified equation. It was only had one term removed, or one term had an extra coefficient or something. And I fixed that, put that into my software, and it all worked. And that's an example of me being able to solve a new problem. I'd never seen that problem before. Because of my previous study, I was able to understand that problem. I didn't understand it exactly. I've never studied control theory. I'd never studied proportional placentical control. But because I knew what integration was and how it worked in mathematics, I could understand what it was meant to do. And I knew that when I ran it, it wasn't doing things properly. So I was able to identify the problem well enough, go back, and that sort of thing is going on all the time, And if it wasn't, you wouldn't be watching this video, because you watching this video relies on a massive amount of technology. It relies on, for example, baseband modulation, for example. People probably won't know what that is. It relies on things like multiplexing of signals down a wire. It relies on the use of fibre optics. It relies on the use of charge-coupled devices. It relies on the use of geometric optics, which is how the lenses and cameras are made to work and made small, so that you can have zoom features and an image can be focused onto a sensor. It requires the knowledge of semiconductor technology and how electrons transfer across a junction between germanium and silicon. All of this I know bits about because I've studied it either at university or in my job, and I understand how the basis of it all works. Because that was formed part of my job. But other people don't understand this, right? And maybe they can't understand it, which is fine. But the point I'm trying to make is, because you can't understand something doesn't mean that it's not true or that somebody is lying to you. Yes. All it means is you can't understand it, right? And it doesn't mean that all the people who can understand it are dishonest. Yes, maybe quite a few of them are. But so I'm in this position where I know stuff. I'm not an academic, I'm not a professional scientist, but I know stuff, and I know stuff that works. And
professional background,
right? And I've worked in engineering. That's the thing. That's where the engineering is different to science. You can spout off in science, and you can spout off and say all these kinds of things about scientific theories, theoretical physics and stuff. But engineering is where the rubber hits the road. It's where science becomes real working things, right?
I suppose basically knowing how things work.
It is. Knowing how things work. And not only that, but improving how things work. And making new stuff which works differently, using less power or more efficiently, because you understand how the old process worked. And then you can see where, for example, it's inefficient, or you can employ a new technique, to improve it. That's why, for example, we now have silicon chips and not discrete transistors. I mean, a transistor was about that big in 1947 when they made it. I think the first transistor was about that big. And if you want to have 1 billion transistors, right, that big, it's going to fill the whole of Derby or bigger. Yet you've probably got 4 billion transistors in that thing there in a tiny chip, and the same in the cameras we're using, because somebody has looked at that problem, worked out what's going on, and said, we can optimize this, So my point is that yes, science produces bad stuff, it produces heat-seeking missiles that kill people and destroy property, etc., but it also produces things that have assisted you and me in moving forward, in gaining enlightenment into certain topics. So again, it's the yin and the yang.
Yes.
We're back to that again. And what I suppose frustrates me is that sometimes there seems to be a lack of appreciation of that, and people like me, we get some blowback, and Richard as well, because he's he and I, as you know, have a very similar background. We worked. Richard used to work on nuclear submarines, for heaven's sake. I've never worked in that sort of environment, and you can't get much more militaristic than that, can you? Although of course they've never been used in warfare, I don't think. So I wrote this article pointing out how you got lay people, and then they haven't really studied science. They're just living hand to mouth. They don't really get involved with science, and they don't really care, which is fine. That's not a problem. And then you have people like the academics who they go to university, and they'll gain expertise in medicine or biology or chemistry or physics or whatever it's engineering, whatever it is, and they'll go into a profession where those skills are employed, and etc. But they will then, when you talk about what we would call conspiracies, or you talk about alternative narratives for COVID or something else, or 9/11, or the use of vaccines generally, when you try and engage them with that sort of a discussion, they will come up with some pretty good arguments, but at a certain point they will just shut down, and they will stop responding when they know that you've got evidence that they can't explain, and they will then. And I've experienced this. People that I went to university with, they won't go beyond. They won't discuss it with me. And same with Dr. Judy Wood, her fellow academics. They just shut down. It's like the evidence doesn't exist, and that's a huge problem. But then you also get people like me who know the value of the academic world, academic study, developing skills in problem solving, either in maths, engineering mechanics, which is Dr. Wood studies. We know the value of that because it produces things like mobile phones or bridges that go across the River Trent, where you can be sure that when you travel across and by your car or on a train, they're not going to fall down because they've been engineered to stay up, based on knowledge of how wind works and how metals forces travel through metal struts, in a complex structure. That's all engineering and science. But there are other people like me who also want to look at the world of the paranormal, for example, UFOs, and get into all of that. So I call the world A people, or the lay people. They just don't really care about any of this. They just want to switch the TV on, have the food, do their job, and go to bed and wake up the next morning and
let life take them.
Let life take them. Repeat the cycle. Go on holiday for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Fine. That's fine. And then you have the academics who want to step up from that. They're kind of maintaining that system and helping to make it work better or more cheaply or whatever, more comfortably. But then there are people like me who have academic knowledge and skills, but we also know that in the paranormal world, when you look at the UFO issue, there's hugely important information there. And some of it has been studied scientifically and evaluated scientifically. And that should be taken seriously by the academic community, and it isn't. But then we get people who start looking at this, and then they, for example, will see these YouTube videos about flat Earth or jet fuel hoax. And people like me, we know that that's total nonsense because we've studied the science behind such things, or we can study the science behind such things. Yet these World A people get really upset with people like me because we're telling them that something they believe is not true, which is what the mainstream tells them. So they're reacting to me like they react to the mainstream, and that's really frustrating that they don't see the difference. And they're supposedly on this path to enlightenment, and yet they're not willing to evaluate things like the flat Earth dispassionately and just forget about it. You should put it on one side. It can be ignored. You can forget about it. It's not an issue. Yet somehow it becomes the most important issue ever.
And the Earth is
flat. Flat.
The Earth is flat.
My reality, my senses tell me that the Earth is flat and stationary.
And so this article, as I say, Worlds Apart, should we trust the science? It was triggered by what I just said about the flat Earth and this developing mistrust in science, particularly because of what's happened with COVID. So that presents another area of conflict within our, thinking communities, if you will. So that was something that I felt was worth addressing in this article. And it's about how your consciousness gets affected by various narratives. The flat Earth is just another narrative. It's not true, it's not true. And anybody that thinks it is true, well, if you want to believe it again, that's fine. But please, don't criticise me when I show you the evidence that it isn't true and it can't be true. Because the same evidence which shows that it can't be true is the same evidence which leads you toward the fact that, for example, your mobile phone actually works and is not just a functionless piece of plastic. It's all connected into the science. And I suppose that brings me back to one of the other things I wanted to mention earlier on. In one sense, the interconnectedness of things, and this is what appealed to me about.
Before you go ahead, I just want to bring in another aspect of that. I suppose this relates to me and Paul and people like me and Paul, because I don't know if I speak for you as well, but I won't say that I'm particularly scientific minded. I'm certainly not engineering minded, but with things like 9/11 and flat Earth, I think there's an aspect of that where you don't have to be, because the evidence is that is if you evaluate it in an open, honest way, you can see quite clearly. I mean, like with it didn't destroy the bathtub, and
that's right,
or the seismic activity of it doesn't account for how the towers fell apparently. Just that aspect, you can look at it and you can see quite clearly that the narrative doesn't. This is the evidence. This is and it's a lot of people can't, I suppose, block their mind from comparing that evidence and looking at it openly and I suppose objectively from other stuff, and that's, I think, an issue as well. I think some people like with 9/11 who have the bombs in the building theory, they just simply can't get past that because they're too much invested in it, and that's it, and there's a block, and that's it.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, an issue as well.
That's it. Yeah. And I think, riding on the back of that, I've been waiting for somebody to show me why the Dr. Judy Wood research is not correct. Come up with another account of the evidence which makes more sense than the one that she has presented to us in the explanation. And I've been waiting 12 years for that. Longer, in fact, and nobody's done it. So, how long should I wait? I think, absolutely. And, so going back to this idea of things being interconnected, these things are interconnected. So science and your level of consciousness and your understanding of science is just one aspect of our reality. And again, I would say that when you start looking at some of these other realities and higher dimensions and things like that and the paranormal, the scientific method has a certain amount of usefulness for investigating things like the paranormal, the features of UFO reports and the meaning of UFO reports. Science can be employed to an extent, but beyond that, you're looking at other methods really, intuition, and looking, for example, at metaphysics, which is what Wilbert Smith talked about in the 50s. We talked about that.